So I keep seeing this thing where people who are borderline are like, I'm taking dialect behavioral therapy and it's not working. And I, I, uh, I realized that there's some psychology about dialect behavioral therapy that needs to be worked through in order for it to fully work. And what I mean by that is for borderline personality disorder, one of the first things in my journal log or whatever I talked about was memory. And in order to actually treat borderline, which is its characteristics has to do with emotional dysregulation. And there are root stem causes to why that person emotionally dysregulates. When they dysregulate, it can cause identity confusion. It can cause fragmentation, which comes off as ASPD. It can cause splitting. It can cause abandonment issues. It can cause anger, right? But what I mean by this is that essentially you have to source where this began. And what is the hardest part about borderline is this getting into the psychology of your own borderline and identifying it. And that's why I feel like journal logging is really, really important, because you're getting in tune with your memory, you're getting in tune with your behavior. Looking at behavior in a third person perspective, so actually stepping out of the situation and like kind of like looking in and going, I'm behaving this way, there's a pattern here, right? And the thing about like dialect behavioral therapy, like for a full proper session to actually get through everything, to see where you fit in the dialogue of like what techniques might actually be suitable for you, it's still going to be like 26 to 52 weeks. And yes, over a certain amount of weeks of utilizing it, you might find some techniques that work. But the reality is that with behavior, and you're working with your synapses in your brain and rewiring innate behavior that you've had since you were like a little, wee one. Essentially what happens is, it takes like 400 times repetitively of doing something before it sticks into your brain. So like DBT essentially becomes like a mindfulness practice. It's like a way of life. Like you actually have to steadily be uncomfortable practicing techniques that don't seem like it works and don't seem like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing on some things. And then realizing that by continuously doing it, that it becomes easier, and it's like you're naturally doing like better like techniques, whether that be, like sensory distraction or hot cold flashes or journaling and reflecting on your behavior and your fragmentations, or breathing techniques, or going for extreme exercise, or having like sensory touch, or asking mindfulness questions. Like, why am I feeling this emotion? Is this emotion gonna go through me, like in the next 3 days, that sort of idea. And so like, there are all these array of like techniques in dialect behavioral therapy, but they are working on all sorts of like dysregulation behaviors, and that could be like sex addiction to like drug addiction to like impulse controls of shopping or whatever that is. And when you're talking about what causes borderline, well, it's like that emotional dysregulation when like you were younger, and that personality warp that may have caused that could be like essentially people in your environment when you were younger that really invalidated your emotions. It could be sexual assault when you were little. It could be like you're a part of the generation where you were just told to like be quiet and not speak, the silent generation. That would have created a lot of borderlines, to be able to repress all that emotion and become like sort of dismissive or avoidant or whatever, right? the other ways is having a parent that had substance abuse, having a parent that had cluster A, cluster B, like mood disorders or a substance abuse problem. Maybe you had your role models passed away when you were young. There's all these different variations of what could have triggered essentially that dysregulation, but everybody's like source to that's going to be a little bit different, and some people are blacking it out right now as like protection mechanisms, and some people aren't, and essentially they're gonna have to go through like an intensive dissection of your brain of where these behaviors stem from. And the reason why I say that is because you can't actually treat the symptom until you know what the symptom is like essentially being caused by. So like in trauma therapy, you would be taking therapy where you would go extensively into every year that you can remember, all the way to maybe you were like 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, and just starting to jog. And it could take you a year to get through all this trauma stuff, because you got to understand that when you're rerouting and coming out with all this trauma stuff, you're going to be having flashes. You're going to be throwing yourself in the wall. You could be having nightmares. It's extensive to actually get into this sort of trauma-based stuff. And then once you start picking up the patterns of where this actually, that initial feeling of abandonment came from, or all that sort of psychology, is like now you can confront that subconscious, unconscious behavior with a conscious look at it, third perspectively, to essentially be like, the reason why I'm going into hysterics when he leaves the door is because I was so scared of being abandoned and left alone, because every single time I was told to be left alone in a room for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, and no one engaged with me, and I had this sort of registration, and etc., etc. So when you start to stem where that behavior comes from, now you understand where your unconscious behavior is coming from. And when you become conscious of it, now you can start to reroute the behavior and apply your dialect behavioral therapy. So I hope that helps. But for therapy with borderline personality disorder, I think the trauma-based memory jogging of where these symptoms come from is just as important as the dialect behavioral therapy when you're dealing with borderline personality disorder. All right, hope that helps. Bye.